Thank you for joining me for this Lifeway study of the Gospel of John. This is session 9, is John chapter 18, verses 1 through 11. The title is, I Am He. And the lesson summary statement is, Jesus is always in control and committed to the redemption of humanity. I'm starting my lesson with an article that I found about the top 5 celebrity arrests. And I may give these examples out, one example to class members to have them read it, but it's James Brown, O.J. Simpson, Mel Gibson, Chris Brown, and Reese Witherspoon. And the interesting thing about each of those is none of them wanted to be arrested. They all found a way in which they tried to avoid arrest, whether it was running away or some kind of an intimidation factor. But you come to a different kind of event with Jesus. Here we have someone who is in charge of the arrest. Up to this moment, Jesus has consistently said that his hour has not come. And the reference to the hour, as you know from studying John's Gospel, is referring to the crucifixion. But now things have changed, and Jesus is now ready to move forward in that. And things are going to happen very quickly, as we see beginning in chapter 18. The first point is show of force, John chapter 18, verses 1 to 3. If a person was wanted by the law in the state of Idaho, where would they not go? It's kind of obvious, isn't it? They wouldn't go to Idaho. And yet here Jesus goes to a familiar place, and Judas knows of this place. And Jesus goes to the place where he knows Judas will lead the group in order to arrest him. So how does that teach us that Jesus is always in control and is committed to the redemption of humanity? And I'm asking about the garden. Why does he intentionally do that? How does that show that he's in control? And I'm looking for things like, well, he's committed to be found. He controls the location of his arrest. He is in charge of all of this. It's a powerful passage that deals that. And then I just want to simply walk through the text and give some explanation. And this passage is just full of all kinds of details. After Jesus had said these things, and that's probably referring to his prayer or maybe the entire farewell discourse from chapter 13 to 17, he went out with his disciples across the Kidron Valley. The Kidron Valley is to the east. It's about 200 feet deep. It's not a difficult, it's in terms of needing a bridge. You can walk across the valley in that day and time. It had a chute that came down from the temple, and when they would sacrifice the lambs there at the temple, the blood from the lamb would drain down this chute into the Kidron Valley. And the name Kidron means dark or dusky or gloomy. And it would be filled during the rainy season. During the dry seasons, it's dry. But Josephus tells us in a Passover that took place sometime after Jesus that they sacrificed 256,000 lambs there at the temple for Passover. So you can imagine that brook is just running dark with blood. And isn't it interesting that Jesus crosses over the blood to lead his disciples eventually to safety and leads him to the cross? It says he crossed the Kidron Valley where there was a garden, and he and his disciples went into it. Now, we know from the other Gospels that it's the Garden of Gethsemane. But when you think of a garden, typically we think about a patch of ground that you grow vegetables or maybe flowers on. But the ancient man had a different understanding of a garden. It would be a place where there might be vegetables and flowers, but there would be shade tree and there would be fresh water. It's more along the lines of what we think of as a park, a place where you would go and rest and be refreshed. And this is where Jesus goes. And it's interesting, many have noticed the parallels that the first Adam sinned in a garden, and the second Adam is going to succeed in the garden. The first Adam failed in Eden, a perfect paradise. The second Adam is going to succeed in Gethsemane. The first Adam hid from God, and Jesus boldly prayed to God. The first Adam took the fruit from Eve's hand. Jesus took the cup of wrath from his Father's hand. It's some very interesting parallels there about that. It just says, and it's interesting that it says Jesus took them to the garden and they went in. John may be playing off of that picture, that the way we get back to the garden, back to the presence of God, is with Jesus. In verse 2 it says, Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, because Jesus often met there with his disciples. This would be a place where he might go to rest and pray, and where he would teach the disciples. So Judas, verse 3, took a company of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and Pharisees and came there with lanterns, torches, and weapons. The Greek language makes it very clear that this company of soldiers were Romans. And your leader's guide will talk about a cohort, and a cohort's a tenth of Roman troops, and that'd be about 600 people. And so Judas took some of these Roman soldiers. It could range anywhere from 60 to 200, but it was a good number. And in addition to that, there were the temple officials. These were policemen who made sure the temple was safe and things went well and were organized. And so they were there. Now, Jesus had had an encounter with some of them earlier in chapter 7, verse 46, when they were sent to arrest him, and they didn't arrest him. They came back, and the priest wanted to know, why didn't you arrest him? And they said, we've never heard anyone speak like this. And so maybe they sent Roman soldiers simply because they didn't trust the temple police to arrest him. And these people represented the chief priests, and there were also Pharisees there. And it says they came with lanterns, torches, and weapons. The Passover occurred during a full moon, so there was lots of light, but Jesus had hid himself previously. By that I mean he would, until it was his hour, he did not put himself in situations where he would be arrested. When John the Baptist was having his troubles, Jesus evacuated Judea to Galilee so that he wouldn't be there and get into the same kind of trouble. There were those who wanted to kill him, and he simply walked through them. And so there were times when he could have been arrested, but he chose not to. And so there may have been in their minds that he has attention, he has an ability to get away. And so despite the bright moon of the full moon, they bring these lights in order for them to search for him if he seeks to run away. And they bring weapons. They are very serious about what they're going to do in terms of arresting Jesus. It is a very powerful picture of what these people are doing in terms of their show of force. Now, on page 90 in your personal study guide, there's a section called Apply the Text. And the way that the personal study guide applies this point is with this statement. Believers can expect enemies of Jesus to use maximum force against him. Now, I found an article. It's entitled, It's Dangerous to Believe, Religious Freedom and Its Enemies by Mary Eberstadt, Eberstadt. And she goes through some of the ways in which force is being used in our day, in our country, against the Christian faith. And so I just wanted to point out some of the things that are in this article and just ask the class, after I pointed out some of the things that she mentions, have you ever experienced anything like this in which there's a pressure put upon you to not live out your faith? For example, one paragraph says, some of the faithful have paid unexpected prices for their beliefs lately. The teacher in New Jersey suspended for giving a student a Bible. The football coach in Washington placed on leave for saying a prayer on the field at the end of the game. The fire chief in Atlanta fired for self-publishing a book defending Christian moral teaching that he was teaching at a church. The Marine court martialed for pasting a Bible verse above her desk, and other examples of intolerance. And anti-Christian activists hurled smears like bigot and hater at Americans who hold traditional beliefs about marriage, and accuse anti-abortion Christians of waging a supposed war on women. And she just chronicles some of these religious institutions that are having their accreditation questioned, and just the show of force. And So I'm asking them, have you experienced anything like this in our day and time? It's not as open and violent as some others that are experiencing it around the world, but there is this effort to silence us and to put us in our place. Well, Jesus wants his disciples to keep their faith despite the awful events that unfold. So what are other examples from the Bible that illustrate the lesson summary statement? Jesus is always in control, and he's committed to the redemption of humanity. It's surprising when you get to think about it, how full the Bible is of this teaching that when you are in an oppressive situation, when there's this show of force against your faith, you are to be strengthened. You're to be buttressed by the fact that your God is in control and he is committed to redemption. I'll give you some examples. And I'm asking the class for these, but just to get things going, here are just a few examples I wrote down. Moses in Egypt. There was a tremendous show of force to try to enslave God's people. Daniel and Babylon. And we have a number of examples out of the story of Daniel of how the state tried to force itself upon these believers. There's Esther in Persia and how she pushed against the anti-Semitic forces that were there. There's Gideon and there's Elijah. And all of the prophets faced the nation that was seeking to silence them in proclaiming the Word of God. So this is a real live issue in our day, and it's always been a live issue for God's people. And over, prophets and priests and kings have illustrated that they believe that God is in control and he's committed to the redemption of humanity. The second point is positive identification. John chapter 8, verses 4 through 9. Now, as I go to read the text, I'd like for you to have a picture in your mind. Picture in your mind that it's outside your house is the police force of your community, in addition to the FBI, in addition to SWAT team that's stationed there. So there's this great, tremendous police force that is against you. They have their bullhorns. They're ready to call you to come to put your hands up and come out and surrender. So there's this great force that is arranged against you. And instead of it happening like what you see on television or what you see in the movies, you step out the door and you tell them how this is going to take place. Now, I don't know that I've ever seen that. Maybe there's a movie that sometime has done something that way, but that's what's happening in this scene. Notice again, verse 4. Then Jesus, knowing everything that was about to happen to him, that's his divine knowledge, went out and said to them, "Who is it that you're seeking?" And Jesus of Nazareth, they answered, "I am he." Jesus told them. Judas, who betrayed him, was also standing with him. Now notice that Jesus takes control of this. He goes out and stands between the enemy and his disciples. And there are a number of movies and stories that we know of someone who sacrifices himself for the others to be saved. Maybe they stay behind to fight off the enemy, to give them time to escape, or maybe they give their life in place of another. Well, here's Jesus doing that. Who is it that you're seeking? And you're going to see, he'll ask it again, and he's wanting to clarify who is it that they've come to arrest. Not, you haven't come for the disciples, you've just simply come for me. And then this statement, "I am he." The word "he" is not in the original language. The translators supply that so that it reads well. But basically, all Jesus said is, "I am." And we're very familiar with that word in John's Gospel as he uses it to describe the ever-present Creator who is everlastingly, universally present. And he is saying, he's identifying himself as he is that being, that eternal constant. And he used it several times to say that he was the source of life for us, that he was the source of bread and the door and the light and the truth and the life and the way. He is the source of all of those evidences of God. And then in verse 6, when Jesus told them, I am he, they stepped back and fell to the ground. Now the commentators are all over the place when they come to explain this one. They don't know whether the first row of soldiers stepped back and stumbled and fell into the others, and they all fell down. That sounds like a cartoon to me. Or it could be that they said just with the sense of his authority and with his being, that it just simply knocked them down. And what's shocking about that is you might get that from the temple priest because they understand the statement when he says, I am. But the Roman soldiers, they don't have a clue about that. But there's something about this event that causes them to fall down. Now, the scriptures teach this is what happens when people come into the presence of God. Paul is on the road to Damascus in Acts chapter 9, and he meets the resurrected Christ, and it knocks him off his animal, and he's on his face before the Lord. Ezekiel has the same experience in chapter 1 when he encounters this vision of God. He gets on his face. He thinks he's almost dead. And so there's something consistent about this. When God shows up, the proper response is a place of worship and submission before him. Then he asks them again. See, he takes over. They've forgotten all of what they're about. So he puts them back on track with what they're doing. Who is it that you're seeking? And they say, Jesus of Nazareth. And in a sense, that is a slam. Nazareth was such a small town. It was a nowhereville. And so we're looking for Jesus of Nowhereville, Jesus of Pleasantville. And so in a sense, it is a knock against Jesus. And Jesus said, I told you I am he. So if you're looking for me, let these men go. That was not a suggestion. That was an imperative. That was a command of Jesus on that passage. Now just imagine if it went that way in these verses. On page 90, again, there is another statement about this particular point. And the statement is, under apply the text, believers can confidently face life knowing that Jesus is in charge. Believers can confidently face life knowing that Jesus is in charge. Do you believe that? If you do, what does that look like in various situations? For example, I don't have control over the number of days that I have to live before I go home to heaven. I don't know how long I'm going to live. So what does it look like for a person who's confident that Jesus is in charge? How do I live this day? How do I live the rest of the days until however many days it is that Jesus takes me home? What does that look like? And what I'm saying is, and what I'm wanting to drive at that is, this lesson has power to it in terms of people. People are so insecure today. People are so uncertain. And yet Christians know that regardless of what's happening all around me, whether it's in control or out of control, this is what I know. Jesus is in control. He is committed to my redemption. So it means that this is the day the Lord has made. Let me rejoice and be glad in it. It means that this is a day that He has something for me in which to serve Him. There's something about this day that He wants to bless me. There's something about this day in which I can come to know Him even better than I knew Him yesterday. And I don't need to worry about those circumstances. I just need to concern myself with my relationship with Him and then get on doing what He's called me to do. Because Jesus is in control, even though I don't have the control over my days. How about this one? I don't have the control over the hearts and choices of my family and friends. There are people that I wish they would do things differently, but I don't have control over their hearts and their minds. I can be an influence, but they're going to choose to live the way they want to live and make their own decisions. So what does it look like for a Christian who realizes I can't control that kid, I can't control that parent, I can control that friend, I just don't have any control over. But I know Jesus is in control. So what does that mean for me? And I want the class to interact with that. You see, this is tremendously practical for what we're learning about Jesus. I don't have control over circumstances. We're in a season now where I live, and we're having these destructive tornadoes in the area. We don't have any control over that. The only thing we have control over is they can tell us about 13 minutes before it gets to us. But in terms of the direction and that the tornado is going to go, no control over that. So there are lots of circumstances we don't have control over. What does that mean? How do I live in the midst of uncontrolled circumstances with the idea and the reality Jesus is in control? I'll tell you, one of the things that's concerning me now is I have grandchildren, and they are getting to the age where they can serve in the military. And what happens if our country goes to war? They won't let me serve in their place because I've passed the age of doing that. And what is that? What's that going to be? Jesus is in control. Security is a big issue today, and there's so much we can't control. And so this question, is Jesus in control and committed to our redemption? That is a very important question to ask. So there is the third point, and that is rebellion snuffed. Now, believers can obediently involve themselves in God's redemptive plan. That's the third point under apply the text. And then I just want to read through the verses and give a brief explanation of them. Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it, struck the high priest's servant, and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. And at that, Jesus said, Peter, put your sword away. Am I not to drink the cup the Father has given me? Now, this is one of those texts where people point to and say, John may have had some kind of relationship or access and knowledge of people who were in the inner circles, because he actually knows this servant's name. And this man, we know from a Matthew passage, was the high priest's servant. His name, Malchus, means king, but not just any king, but it's the idea of the ruling king. And it's interesting, the scripture says he cut off his right ear. That tells us something about Peter was probably aiming for his head. But being a servant, this Old Testament tells us if a servant wanted to give his whole life to a master, then they would go to a doorpost and they'd take an awl and he'd punch a hole in his ear. And from that point on, that servant was forever serving that master. And someone has said it might be interesting to note that maybe if that was the ear that had the hole in it, that when Peter damaged that ear and Jesus healed it, maybe he healed the hole in the ear so that Malchus could make a decision about who would really be his master now. That's speculation, but that's interesting thought. So the point is that Peter's actions of rebellion are against the will of God, and he gives a bad testimony for the Lord. And so here's the way I'm trying to apply this lesson. Here's some areas where Christians make Christianity look bad. But if they really believed that Jesus was in control and that he was committed to our redemption, maybe we would respond differently. So for example, how do we make Christianity look bad when it comes to the subject of witnessing? And I'm talking about there where we pressure people, we intimidate people, we're harsh or rude, we're demanding. I'm talking about if we really truly believe Jesus was in control when it came to our witnessing, we would always share with kindness. We wouldn't pressure people because that's the work of the Holy Spirit. Now, I'm not saying you don't tell them the truth. Tell them the truth, but in terms of the pressure being applied for them to make a decision, that needs to come from the Spirit of God. Tactfully select the moment. Tactfully select the method. I mean, when it comes to witnessing, if you clearly believe Jesus is in control and that He's committed to that person's redemption, that should have a guide on how we witness. What about money? If we believe that Jesus is truly in control and He's committed to human redemption, how do we deal with money? Well, we don't manipulate. We don't promise people wealth. We don't judge people right or wrong or great or little based on their money, because that is Jesus' business. And a third category is illness and suffering. If we really believe that Jesus is in control, how can we deal with people in a way that is good? Because there are ways in which we've dealt with people in the past that have been bad. Terrible things have been said to people who are suffering. So those are just some ways I thought about applying this lesson. When it comes to closing the lesson, I found the text to the spiritual, He's got the whole world in His hands. And I made a copy of that, and I'm going to give a copy to each sheet. We have some people in our church who can sing. I'll ask them to lead us in singing this. If I don't have anybody there that can sing, then we may just read this. But this very simple little spiritual really drives home the point that He's got the whole world in His hands and we can trust Him. This is a wonderful lesson. Thank you for teaching God's Word.